This is the Viltrox 23mm 1.4 for the Fuji X mount system. The Viltrox 23mm is part of a trio of new lenses being released for the Fuji X mount system. This will be the second autofocus native Fuji X mount third-party lens system to be announced to date. That makes this a very interesting lens lineup for Fuji owners. The only third-party autofocus lenses that exist for Fuji are the Zeiss 2-it lenses. While those lenses are awesome, they do cost quite a lot of money brand new, and they were released pretty much when the X system came out, so it's been years since there's been any new autofocus lenses built specifically for the Fuji X mount system. This lens is a direct competitor to the Fuji 23mm XF 1.4 lens. The Fuji version costs $899, while the Viltrox lens comes in at $329. Its autofocus has an aperture ring and is a native X mount, just like the Fuji branded lens. So the build quality of the Viltrox 23mm 1.4 is fantastic. It's just as good as any other Fuji lens. It's an all-metal construction. The rings turn really smoothly. It does have an aperture ring, though I do have an issue with that, which I'll talk about in a little bit. Metal lens hood, everything that you'd come to expect from, a high-quality lens, especially the Fuji lenses, which are pretty much all metal. Sort of feels like a smaller package just because the XF version is kind of wide, but it's definitely lighter than the Fuji version. Another difference that you'd be missing out from the Fuji version is the clutch manual focus. That has a focus ring where you can pull back and it reveals a hyperfocal distance scale and then switches the camera automatically to manual focus. That's actually pretty cool, and the manual focus on that lens is pretty good, especially because it has hard stops, which this lens does not have. It's gonna manual focus just like any other Fuji lens, except for those clutch focusing ones. The optical characteristics of this lens are pretty cool. The bokeh definitely has an interesting look once you start to get to the edges of the frame, which I like a lot. A lot of people hate the cat's eye look and bokeh being weird in the corners. That's one of my favorite things, period, about lenses, honestly, is how the bokeh is rendered in the corner of the images. A lot of new lenses these days, the image circle is built larger than the actual sensor size, so it gets rid of some of those cat's eye effects because you're not really getting the projected image off the edge of the diameter of the glass. You're only getting sort of that center of the image circle. I like when lenses use that full image circle and give you sort of an interesting rendering to the bokeh and the edges of the image. The lens does display some chromatic aberration, but that's to be expected from a cheaper lens. That being said, I don't think chromatic aberration and even vignetting, which this lens also does exhibit as well, I don't think those are necessarily indicators of something that's bad. It might indicate something that's cheaper just because, the more expensive lenses, they have a lot more elements to correct for that, higher quality coatings and stuff like that. But I shoot a lot of vintage lenses and generally prefer the look of a vintage lens to a modern lens. So these optical flaws in the glass actually give it more of a vintage feel, gives it a little bit more character than modern clinically perfect lenses. So honestly, when I see something like that, I actually embrace it and think it's a benefit to the lens as opposed to a drawback. Pretty much any lens is good at f8. Just stop the lens down and that stuff will start to go away, just like any other lens. The autofocus on this lens does seem to be faster and more advanced than the Fuji version. It's a newer autofocusing motor. They label it as an STM motor, so I don't know if they're using the same technology that Canon uses or just kind of labeling that to just tell you that it's sort of like a more advanced, newer type of focusing system. It works well in photos, really fast, really responsive. Video, it works both good and bad. I'm actually using the Viltrox 23 to shoot this video right now, and you can see that it's not really stuttering, it's not really hesitating on keeping focus on my face, even even if I'm moving back and forth a little bit. Where the issue lies is that the lens disregards the autofocus tracking sensitivity and speed in the Fuji autofocus menu. Basically, if you set the speed and the sensitivity all the way to the lowest setting on this lens, it will still act as if it was at the highest speed, highest sensitivity. So if you leave frame, it'll snap like as fast as ever to the next thing to focus on instead of moving at a slow pace if you set it to that slow speed. So just keep in mind that if you want to use this for video and you're trying to rack focus with autofocus, it's not really going to look very natural until hopefully they come out with a firmware update that will fix that issue in the lens. The lens does have a USB port on the bottom that will allow for firmware updates in the future, so hopefully that's something that they do roll out as a firmware update. For some reason, this lens has a clickless aperture ring. Now, a clickless aperture ring is generally more useful for video and in situations where you either want to dial in the aperture and the exposure to a really precise level. So having basically infinite steps between stops allows you to really just dial it in like exactly how you want it. Another instance where you'd want a declicked aperture is if you were trying to smoothly change between one exposure level to another. So imagine you were on a steady cam going in from outside. The exposure is obviously drastically different from inside to outside. So what you would do is you would hook a follow focus up to the declicked aperture, and then you could pull the aperture to a wider aperture as you're going into the building. And then it would give you, a correct, smooth exposure change as you enter the building. Those are really the only cases where a clickless aperture is useful. The failure here lies in the software in the Fuji camera. The software in the camera only interprets each stop and doesn't actually ramp between the stops. You don't get the smooth transitional fade from like 1.4 to 2. It'll go like 1.4, 1.6, 1.8, 2 each time it hits one of those stops. I don't understand why they put a declicked aperture in here. It doesn't work with the software of the Fuji camera. So basically all it does is make your aperture ring like really easy to bump by accident and set to something you didn't mean to set it to. Pretty pointless, and hopefully they change it in the future. So I had the awesome opportunity to test this lens out thanks to pergear.com. They were kind enough to send me over this lens, and I got to play with it for about the last month or so. Given that it's COVID-19 time right now, it's been a little tough to get out and get the photos that I would usually get, or get the number of photos that I want. So I apologize for the photos not necessarily being up to the caliber that they usually are in my videos, but hopefully they're interesting enough to kind of see what this lens can do in some certain cases. I've edited a lot of these photos in this video with my new Lightroom preset pack. Haven't put out a preset pack before. A lot of people have been asking me about the color grading of my images. I figured that I might as well put out a pack and see if people are interested in it. So you can check that out in the link below the subscribe buttons. Just let me know what you guys think. So I think this new Viltrox line of lenses really does mean a lot for the Fuji community. The Zeiss 2-it lenses were announced with the original interchangeable X mount. It's really the first third-party lens lineup that we've had since the launch of the camera. So it's pretty huge, especially considering the price is about half of the competing version of the Fuji lenses. So if you're kind of debating like, well, I should get the f2 just because I don't want to spend as much money for the 1.4, but I really want the 1.4, the quality is good enough. If you like vintage glass like I do, having optical flaws is sort of like what we look for in vintage lenses. Any lens to me can be good. It just depends on what you're using it for and if that look is applicable to what you're shooting. I'm definitely going to be using it a lot in the future because I've been in a place where I'm assuming a lot of you are. I really wanted that 1.4 23mm Fuji lens, but couldn't really justify the $900 price tag for it. Now that there's something that's less than half the cost, I think it's almost like a no-brainer for a lot of people out there, especially considering it's basically the best of both worlds as far as like the Fuji lenses go, since it's the autofocus speed, silent motor operation of the f2 lenses but in a 1.4, which I think Fuji should be doing, refreshing all of their 1.4 lineup anyway. This kind of achieves that 1.4 but fast autofocus refresh that all of us have been wanting anyway. So honestly, I think it's a no-brainer if you're looking for this focal length. Just go ahead and pick it up. I hope this lens is a glimpse into the future of the Fuji system, where we see more third-party lens manufacturers coming out with affordable but awesome third-party autofocus lenses.